Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm so sorry that I can't be there today in person. Unfortunately, I've had a family emergency and it means that I need to stay in the country, but I would have loved to have been there. Heidi, thank you so much for inviting me, and I know we've organised that I will come later on in the year, so I hope I will see everybody that's here today. I can't see you now, but I hope that I'll see you then. I've been asked here today to speak about not only my experiences as somebody with autism, but also about my experiences with autism from a developmental perspective. Heidi and I first connected during a meeting of Autism Europe, where I was talking about autism from a developmental perspective, which is slightly different than some of the books you still read nowadays, where even now it's described as a defect or something that doesn't work right in the brain. On my right there should be the PowerPoint now, so I'd like to take you through my PowerPoint for today. My life, when I was born, my parents knew that there was something slightly different, but then again I think, yeah, doesn't every parent think that their child is special or unique, or but it is interesting to know that research has been done in, for example, the South of America, where first-time parents who don't have any experience with young children, generally the mothers will know within 2 weeks of the child being born that there is something different. And they sometimes can't put their finger on it, but they know there's something. And when I asked my mother years ago when I was making a presentation, I asked her, did you have that feeling as well? She said yes. And she described to me the feeling that she had. It was 2 days after I was born. And she said, I knew that you couldn't focus, because babies, they can't focus yet properly. But she said, you opened your eyes, I was alone with you. She said, you looked at me. And she said, it was almost as if you could look through me into my soul. It was such a deep connection and observation that she had thought at that moment, she is going to be a challenge, and that was true. Luckily, I grew up in an environment which was very, very accepting of, in that sense, differences. I grew up in an environment of an international school where kids came from about 75 different nationalities, and they studied there for 2 years between the ages of 16 to 19. So, in a way, difference, diversity, it was normal. It was only when I went out into the real world that I realised that there was quite a lot of intolerance in the world, that my reality and the reality of those students and the children that I played with in the college was actually not the general reality. But it was okay, because the greatest part of my life was an environment where I felt accepted and embraced for who I was. I also had a lot of freedom. I say to people that my diagnosis, I received that, classic female, I received that when I was 24, so late. But I also say that from about the age of 16, it would have been helpful to have known, what was going on, because I really was so doing my best the whole time, and I was so tired. I was exhausted. So from that point, I say it would have been good to have known that there was something different happening. But before then, I did not need a diagnosis, because the environment was so accepting of diversity, and I was just Monique, so it wasn't a problem. And I had parents who didn't feel judged in any way. And if I speak to parents now, and I work together with parents, and do coaching, that's one of the things that I hear an awful lot, which really hurts my heart so much, that parents feel judged when most of the time they're doing absolutely the right thing for their kids, because they know their kids the best, but still they get that judgment. But people with autism experience this as well, maybe even worse. And I'll get onto that a little bit later. So once I got my diagnosis, that was in 2009, it was for me a very good experience, because I didn't have anybody telling me that this is your autism, so this is something that you can't do, and it's okay that you can't do it because you have autism, which is often meant really nicely, but It's about as, for me, ridiculous as somebody saying to me, it's okay that you can't do that because you're blonde. You know, it's not a problem. Because you're blonde, you can't help it. But I know I'm making it ridiculous, but that's how it sounds often in my mind, that I think, how little do we know about the potential for somebody's development, that then we can even still say, I still hear that professionals have said to parents that if their child doesn't speak before the age of 6, don't expect it. And I think, how dangerous is that? To say to parents, just don't expect it, and that some parents might believe that because they have respect for the professional. And there are how many cases now of young people who start speaking when they're much older, and they understood everything. And often they were in the room when it was being said that don't expect them to speak. Can you imagine how that feels for your internal self-image, that development? That doesn't exactly encourage you. So what I did was, I believed in development from the beginning, and I had hope. And hope is so vitally important. I also learned very quickly, because of course I started reading everything that I could find, I started realising that autism is an umbrella term, that we really don't understand an awful lot about it. Looking into, for example, the DSM-5, when it was renewed from the DSM-4, then you saw that, for example, Rett's disorder, which was classified as autism, that disappeared out of the DSM-5 because they realised it was a one-gene mutation. And when you're talking about Rett's disorder, it is horrific. If you're a boy and you get Rett's disorder, mostly girls have it, then you can die. So, but we thought for years and years and years that Rett's disorder was under autism. So I learned very quickly to be careful about what I read. And a lot of the things that I read, I thought, no, the half of it, I can find myself in that. And the other half, I thought, no. If somebody's explaining that something doesn't work right, that doesn't rhyme with my internal knowledge, that something is going wrong at some points in my life, yes, absolutely, without a doubt. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone looking for an answer, and I wouldn't have gotten a diagnosis. But I never could believe, when I read things about the brain, it doesn't work right, I could never believe that. And I'm so relieved that I didn't. It's quite a depressing thought in a way. So I went looking for more information, and I found the book A Strange World by Martine Delfos that my sister referred me to. She'd already done a lot of research, luckily, because autism is in the family, and she said, you should read this book. It might answer a few more of your questions than other books. And I read it, and I thought, yeah, this rhymes with how I feel internally, that I feel very young in some things, but I feel very old in other things. And both those aspects have gotten me into problems in my life because of how people react to it. So I thought, right, what can I do today? I can let my mentor and my teacher explain it to you herself, of the developmental theory on autism, of a delayed social emotional development and an accelerated cognitive development. So here's Martina Delfos to give you a very short explanation, which will be the red thread throughout my lecture today.
What is autism?
Well, autism, in fact, like people use it, is a very, very broad concept. When I speak about autism, I do not mean autistic behavior, because we all have autistic behavior, for instance, when we are very, very, very ill. Autism is an accelerated and a delayed development at the same time. And the start is with the acceleration, with the cognition. So that means that children with autism, in their baby brain, start thinking. So you have an enormous capacity to work out things. Later they start with more social focus, but then everyone is used to that comes earlier. So they find the children strange, and they don't know how to act upon them. And they think it's a defect, which it isn't. And they treat children awkwardly, because they don't know how. And the children feel bad, and they withdraw into themselves. and they got more autistic behavior than would be necessary at all. That's what I think that autism is.
You can maybe all understand why I work together with her. All of people with autism and also their families is great, and I think you can feel that in the film that I just showed. She's never seen autism as a defect, but also realised very quickly that it's an umbrella term for many, many, many different types of diagnoses. And because we don't understand the human brain, and because we're so still new that in research into the brain and the body, and yeah, then you can still classify something like Rett's disorder incorrectly under autism, which is quite an extreme difference of something where you can die from as a boy, or autism where you have children who are just developing differently. So what Martina talks about very much is that it's not a disorder, but that it's an atypical development. And that can give very, very big problems because the world is not set up to deal with children who are developing in a different order. We expect certain things to happen at a certain time, and if that doesn't happen, yeah, then that's odd or strange. And then parents can go looking for answers. A delay in acceleration of development, I recognise that very much by myself, that when I look back, that I see the delay of the social emotional development, that I was much younger than my physical years, absolutely. Definitely I saw it in the area of making friends, that it was more, a little bit more functional in the beginning, that I analysed very much the situation of, okay, girls always had a best friend, so I made sure that I had a best friend. My deepest friendship with my best friend Jess, we know each other since high school, and in the beginning when I was younger it was very much also a safety aspect as well, but now I'm 34, the depth of our friendship is so much more that I think only maybe in the past 5-6 years, that's when I really see that development that started happening of that deep friendship connection. So I just needed to catch up a little bit, but it can be a problem in school at that time if you don't know how to make friends. Nobody explains to you how to make friends. That all happens when you're younger, and when you're younger, essentially I think a child with autism is busy developing other things. We often explain that as the child with autism is not busy with that. That's sort of like half the truth. The child with autism is not busy with that because they are busy with something else. And that's when the accelerated cognition comes into it. That you see that they're busy thinking, analysing, yet if they don't verbalise it, then you don't know what's going on in their head. And it's only afterwards when they get older that they can sometimes explain of how deep their thinking was. And that I find personally really fascinating, and I recognise that for myself, and my family around me recognises it very much. So what you see now is a simple diagram which helps me an awful lot, that if you see TD stands for typical development, because typical development does exist. Typical development, that you see a child, they develop social, emotional first and then cognition. And you can see that by how our school system is put into place in many, many, many countries. That first children are not expected to learn their times tables, they are expected to play. And that's social emotional development. How do you play with someone? How do you make contact? How do you make friends? Learning that if you want the toy, you can't just push somebody out of the way and grab the toy. Yeah, and then you have children with autism, as I understand it, of the delay in acceleration, where you see that they're busy with something else. So an example is often named of, you have a child without autism who's playing with a little toy car and they're running it over the ground and going vroom vroom. And then you have the child with autism who then picks up the car and turns it upside down and starts flicking the wheels and looking at it. And then we often label that as obsessive behaviour, strange behaviour. But if you look at it from the concept of developing cognition, intelligence, what is he doing at that moment? Is he trying to analyse the fact that if he touches one wheel, when he can't see the connection with the other wheel, that the other wheel moves as well? And how is that possible? You can think really deeply about that as a little kid. But if we label that as strange or odd or not wanting to make contact, then you put a kid very much in a box of odd or autistic. Whereas I'm always fascinated to look at it from the developmental perspective of they're doing something different, but what are they doing? And how can we connect with them at that moment in time so that there is a connection in some way? Not forcing them. Forcing does not help the brain to develop. It doesn't. Forcing means stress, and a stressed brain does not make very good connections. So it's finding how to connect, but in a way which is complementary to the developmental order of that child. So I felt young and old at the same time growing up. That was my standard feeling, and that has not gone away. But I do notice that that feeling, the difference, is less pronounced as I get older. And I think that has something to do with definitely the social emotional development that I see that it is coming closer to my physical age. And that makes a really, really big difference. And why is that happening? Yeah, I have people around me who love me. I have friends who I can also learn from an awful lot. I have work. Makes a big difference. You learn so much from contact with people in work. And I love the work I do. I love speaking. I love learning from other people. I find it such a pity that I can't be there today, because when people ask me questions, I also get to ask them questions. And then I learn so much, especially from different cultures. That was my reality growing up. So I embrace diversity, because for me, diversity is the norm. And sadly, the world is not that far often in that awareness. You can still read that autism is seen as a defect. And what do you see then? A lot of the behaviour is essentially labelled as an aspect of autism. So you hear that autistic behaviour. I'll come to that later on. But therefore, it's then not changeable. And I'm not talking about change in the way of learning tricks. I often hear that as well, tips and tricks. True development happens from the inside, and it means that you can transfer that development to different areas of your life. And often what we're busy with children with autism is learning tricks, because we're not connecting to their unique path of development. Every child, autism or not, they have a unique path of development. But especially children with autism, it seems that that unique path is even more extreme. And if you don't connect to that, then potentially children are forced into a path which causes them much, much more stress. And again, what I said, a stressed brain does not learn very well. The perspective of delay and acceleration in development, what you see is then the possibility of progression, the possibility of development, but in your own tempo and in your own order. I never say that everybody is going to become the same. You can't say that, it's ridiculous. It's like saying every woman will become the same sort of person in their development. You can't say that. But what you can say is that we know so little in a way about the brain. But what we do know is that it is quite phenomenal of how it can develop. And if given the right tools and the right environment and the right attitude of the people around them, then the chance for the brain to move along and for the body to move along as well is maybe increased. So that's why I go back to having a basic attitude. Potentially that's much more helpful if you're trying to help people with autism, because if you have that attitude that you do not understand, then it means that you're going to try to connect to that person in order to try to understand what they mean and what they're saying and their interpretation and what they need from you. It means that you're not going to make assumptions. And maybe assumptions are the most damaging in the world of autism. I'm not sure. But maybe assumptions is something that's the most damaging in the world in general. If we make assumptions that we understand one another, we see it between men and women. It's quite a dangerous thing to do, especially in a relationship. We all understand that, right? Everybody's probably been in a relationship. Assuming that you understand the other person, that's when things can really go wrong. Instead of asking a question of, have I understood you right? So an example of this is a scheme that has been made regarding the developmental ages of a 8-year-old child. We've taken a couple of areas of development, so one being attachment, the other being language, for example, and physics. What you can see is the disharmonious developmental profile of potentially of a child with autism, where you have, on the one hand, you have a very young development, so she's 8 years old, but in the area of attachment, she's at the developmental age of a 1-year-old. But then in the area of physics, for example, she's at the age of a 15-year-old. The difficulty is, imagine what we do with 8-year-olds. With 8-year-olds, they go to school. They go to school for quite a long time of the day, and they're separated from their parents or their caregivers. If you have a young attachment level, then that can be very traumatic, especially if we don't recognise what's going on. When I talk to parents, what they often say is what made the big difference in handing their child over to school was the fact that there was a teacher there who took the child underneath their wing. And often when I talk with parents about how did it feel to bring your child to school for the first time, that what they say is, I knew that mentally, cognitively, he was okay, or she wouldn't have a problem with the learning aspect, but socially, she's so young, or emotionally, it doesn't feel right that he's separated from me. And the parents are right. If you look at it from this perspective, the parents are right. They instinctively feel that their child is emotionally younger than the physical age. The intelligence, not a problem, but just the contact, the attachment, what we call then. And then the difference of a good teacher, that makes all the difference, that you can hand your child over to somebody where they can develop a safe bond with. So it's not as dangerous. But if children don't have that, then it can be a very traumatic experience, and you see the amount of children who fall out of education eventually. I wonder if this has a big part to play, that if we could connect more to the developmental age in the area of attachment, that we could make it a safer experience for children for the transition. Also in the area of acceleration, so physics, yeah, if you have a child who is really busy with knowledge gathering and really wants to understand the material, the difficulty is in school that you not only can be rejected for the youngness, but you can also be rejected for the older part of you, which is essentially a strength. But then you're rejected also for your strength. In school, I often asked a lot of questions in certain subjects because I really wanted to understand what the teacher was saying, and I was genuinely fascinated and interested. However, if you do that, you have your classmates who essentially they want to just get out of the lesson as quickly as possible. And of course I understood this from the perspective of lessons I didn't enjoy, but if it was a lesson I did enjoy, I went fully into asking questions. And so your classmates can become quite annoyed at you, and I never really understood why that was, because I thought, but isn't it respectful to ask a teacher to make sure that you understand them? And of course it is, but it's also handy to know that other people just want to leave. So finding a sort of middle ground at that age would have probably helped me an awful lot. And so yes, I was bullied, I was called SWAT, I was called nerd. The big difference was that I had my best friend Jess, and we were together. And so we were both called SWATs and nerds and horrible names by the girls, but we didn't really care because we had each other, and that made us stronger. So continuing on from what I said about defect, putting us in the mindset that you have autistic behaviour and therefore it doesn't differ or change, or it will be something static. For me, when I hear autistic behaviour, the first thing that I think of is stress. Stress is something that within the world of autism we do not talk about enough. Every human being has stress. So yes, people with autism also have stress. And yes, parents of children with autism also have stress. If you don't connect to somebody's stress, you can't help them very well. That goes for if it's a parent or even a professional or a child or an adult with autism. And when I look at this table on my right, that's a lot of autistic behaviour, what you read in books, so things like aversion to change, it's a big one, extreme focus on the mother, rituals, rocking, doing your best, trying to get out of the situation, so isolation, self-hypnotic behaviour. They're all things which you often read in books still as autistic behaviour, yet I can place them very easily in the context of trying to prevent anxiety, or you already have so much anxiety that you're trying to deal with that anxiety, and as a child especially, you deal with it in the best way that you can and with the possibilities that you have at that moment in time. So the things that I've coloured in red, those are all things that I have had or I still do have. The interesting thing which I'll share with you all today is that the doing your best, that I've only coloured that red since about 3 weeks. And I've been sharing this scheme, which is from Martina, since 2010. Yet, for some reason, I didn't connect doing your best to myself. And this is to do with self-image. And the irony is that you try to help other people, and yet you don't realise something basic about yourself that you can acknowledge. That yes, I did always do my best. It's still now a difficult thing to say, because when you fail after doing your best, then especially as a child, your logic goes to, you didn't do your best. I've never really had the environment tell me that I didn't do my best. In that sense, the voice in my head was strong enough. I didn't need the environment. I dread to think what would have happened if I would have also had from the environment the message that I wasn't doing my best. I think I would be a very, very different person today. So the importance of telling people with autism, you are doing your best. And if they're not, if you think they're not doing their best, then you know that something has really happened to essentially traumatize them. That the only thing maybe they know how to do is to try to avoid the situation. But in that aspect, they're also doing their best because they're trying to avoid that they go into that anxiety mode, because it is not nice, it doesn't feel nice, and you don't want to be there. So when I work with children with autism and young people, then that's one of the things that I share as number one, that I know you're doing your best. And I see the recognition in their eyes. The fact that I also have a diagnosis sometimes helps, because they see that I recognise that very much from myself. But I find it an irony that only now, after years, can I say and can I colour that text in as, yes, I did do my best, and I do my best. Even when I feel that it's not good enough, I still did my best. So the question is, who can you tell today, whoever that is, that you believe that they're doing their best? That reduces stress in another person, and that also makes connection. But you have to mean it. But that's my challenge to you all today. Who can you share that feeling with, that they are doing their best? You might see something very special happen in somebody's eyes when you do that. So selective perception is something that I'm particularly really fascinated with, and I've experienced that myself. It's about the idea of that suddenly you start seeing things in the environment because it's linked to you, and before you didn't really see it, but it was still there. Selective perception. So when I got a Chihuahua puppy, then suddenly I saw Chihuahuas everywhere. And it wasn't that there was an explosion of Chihuahuas in my environment, it was just because I had one that then I started seeing them everywhere. The same goes for when I got my first car a few years ago, and it's a Ford car. It has a very distinctive shape, little bubble car, quite cute. And suddenly now I see those cars everywhere. And I have quite a warm feeling towards the people who are driving them. I feel a connection, even though there's no connection there, but the connection is that selective perception, that you think, oh, you also chose the same car as me, that's nice. And especially when you see the same colour, I find it quite fun to then try to sometimes, yes, I know this sounds crazy, but it amuses me, to actually, if I'm parking, last week then I could park next to a Ford car. And it was also a dark Ford car. So that's my sense of humour, that I find that amusing, that I wonder who bought that car, and I wonder what their life is like. Selective perception is also really important from the perspective of language use, especially when it comes to autism. So I have a couple of words that you often hear still. Those are disease, disturbance, disorder, and limitations. Yeah. Can you imagine if then you are you're tuned to those words, and you're busy developing your character, because everybody develops their character, and yet you read this or you hear this from the environment, it's okay, it's autistic disorder. How do you think that affects somebody's self-development and self-awareness? It's not really positive stuff, right? It's okay, it's a limitation of autism. It's a disturbance in the brain. It doesn't work quite right, it works differently. It works differently to other people. That's heavy stuff to carry with you as a person who has the diagnosis themselves, especially as a child. Children don't choose to be diagnosed themselves. Adults choose usually, or the environment says you need to go and do this and find out what it is, otherwise we have a problem. But children don't choose. So the environment chooses for them. And the language is very, very important. When I think of autism and language which I use, then I talk more about, and I need to read it off from my sheet now, I talk about development and diversity, atypical and precision, amongst other words. Atypical, yes, absolutely. I can embrace the idea that I have followed a very atypical development profile, and that's given quite a lot of challenges in the world in some aspects, and in other aspects it's helped me an awful lot. Sometimes I needed to recognise how it was helping me, because I was also criticised for the positives. But now, as a 34-year-old, I'm more confident in those aspects. So selective perception is really, really, really important, especially when talking around children. The question is, how can we encourage not an overly positive, because I don't like that one either. We often go in development, we go from one extreme to the other extreme. What's the middle ground? What's the more reality? That atypical development, talking about development, talking about diversity. Autism has always been here. It's never not been here. There's nothing unique about that, but it's how we deal with people where you have that atypicalness. Are we afraid of them, or do we try to connect with each individual? So from the perspective of behaviour versus reason, often the autistic behaviour, it's taken as a given, whereas I then ask the question, which also a lot of other people ask luckily, of why is that behaviour happening? There's always a reason for every behaviour that we have as human beings, whether you have autism or not, it doesn't matter, there's always a reason. The only thing we have is that we don't understand the reason. It's not the person's problem, it's our problem of not understanding the reason. So we have to work hard to understand that, just as often women need to work very hard to understand men, and men need to work very hard to understand women. It's quite a natural thing. Yet when you stick it onto autism, then that naturalness of not understanding seems to get lost, because then there's a lot of focus of trying to understand, because often you see the distress of children or people with autism. And the same goes for trying to understand what families are going through. The professionals see the distress they're in, so you try to understand from your own knowledge base. And understanding that you don't understand can be a really, actually quite a nice place to be in, because then you come into true contact with another person. But if you do see behaviour that amazes us and that we don't understand, then what you can do in order to help to try to think from that developmental perspective of delay acceleration is that you can ask yourself, this is typical behaviour at the age of. And often when you have behaviour that amazes you or confuses you, or often you'll come out at a much younger age. And the brilliant thing is that if you can try to find in that area, what's that developmental age of that person, that you have more of an idea of the type of knowledge you give at that age. Parents are busy 24 hours per day nearly of giving information to their children. It's amazing the job that parents do, and it really is a job. But what happens is that we give knowledge to children instinctively based on the physical age they are at. So when a child is 15, you think, well, you should really understand how to make friends, right? Well, no. If they were busy at the age when you were giving all of that information, or the environment was giving all of that information, if they were busy with developing something very, very different, they weren't focused on the social aspect yet, but they are beginning to focus on the social aspect now, then they've missed quite a lot of information. Because development happens, of course, naturally, but it's because of all of the information that's being fed, of the context being given the whole time. We build frameworks in our world of this is how you make friends, and the frameworks, they happen almost intuitively. It's beautiful. But with children with autism, if you have to give that knowledge at an older age in a respectful manner that fits their intelligence, which is important, you don't give an explanation that you give to a 2-year-old, because they're not 2 anymore, they're 15. But if you can acknowledge of what's the sort of knowledge you give at that age, then maybe it gives you more of a direction to go of how you can help that person. And also explaining to them. I explain the developmental perspective of delay acceleration to them, and I just explain it as you were busy with something different. You were busy with physics, or you were busy with analysing something, or you were busy with the weather, or you were busy with movement. You were busy with internal development. It's not something to be ashamed of. It just went differently. But it does mean that maybe you miss a bit of knowledge, but that's not a problem, because if you know that, you can start asking questions. And that's something that I wish that I would have known earlier, of the asking questions in regards to helping myself with the younger development. That would have helped me an awful lot, as long as it was given from the perspective of this is not a defect, it's just your brain is developing differently. So it just means you need to do something different, and yeah, that's going to take more energy, and so you need to be careful also with your energy levels. So whatever I've said here today, what I also always say to everybody is that you have to be critical of what everybody says, because the fact is we don't understand. And what I'm saying as well, test it against your own internal knowledge. If there are people with autism in the room today, test it. What I'm saying about that young and that old, and that you were busy with developing something different and thinking, test that knowledge with how you feel, because we don't know yet. But what I do know is that this resounds more with me and with the people I work with, nationally and internationally, than defect perspective. An example of being cautious about listening to people and being critical is, for me, a classic example of how we always thought that the brain was protected by the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so we knew this, right? Yeah, well, got that one a bit wrong. In 2000, and I think it was 15 or maybe even 16, research came out, and fascinating research, which has literally changed how we think about the immune system and the brain. It's massive. All of the books on the immune system are going to have to be rewritten, literally. And the interesting thing was that there was a vessel in the brain, and neurosurgeons knew about this vessel. They knew about it behind the left ear. And when they taught their students, they said, whatever you do, just don't touch it. Because if you touch it, if you damage it, then catastrophic brain problems happen. But they didn't know what it was, apparently. Until 2015-16, they discovered that the immune system You really need to prepare for this. The immune system is directly connected to the brain. We always thought that the blood-brain barrier was a protective barrier from the immune system and the brain. Now, we know that that's not the case. We know that the immune system is directly linked with the brain. This is going to change everything in the world of understanding about the brain. And I find that fascinating because it reminds me as well of how little we understand. So when I read books where an explanation of autism or a justification of a method or is given on the basis of the understanding of the brain, then this is what I think about. That I think, right, okay, we didn't even know that the immune system was connected to the brain directly. So how much more do we not know? These sorts of things fascinate me because it's very easy to not be critical enough when it comes to autism. And I say this also to people with autism, that I say, okay, yeah, maybe you haven't heard about this one, or maybe you have, brilliant, but this is only recent. So if we got this one wrong, and that's pretty wrong in a big way, then it's absolutely plausible to think that really we know very little about autism in regards to the brain. We haven't even, what I said earlier, we haven't even mapped the whole human brain. It's crazy. So be critical of anything people say, but also about what I'm saying, because I don't know either, but I know that this resonates more with me. So to nearly finish up, what I wanted to share with you was a comment, a statement that was made by Steve Silberman in regards to a question that he was asked about what's the most challenging aspect for the autism community at this moment in time. And I found his response really, really recognisable and interesting. So I'd like to share that with you today. And also I asked the same question of my mentor, Martina Delfos, to see what would she say. And it's really, both responses are very interesting for myself. And I'm wondering if you, the people sitting here today, recognise this as well. So Steve said, there are too many to mention, so I'll just focus on one. The level of rancour and backstabbing in the entire autism community is devastating to everyone. It comes from all directions, from parents, from clinicians, and from people on the spectrum themselves. No one is spared. The toll this takes on the community as a whole is absolutely tragic. Many of the autistic bloggers who inspired me when I started writing in Neurotribes have gone dark, silenced, because they couldn't take the sheer level of personal attacks that were aimed at them daily. I recognise this personally because I'm also following a different path to what the traditional triad of impairments have been. That's not including, in that sense, theory of mind, because Simon Baron-Cohen talked about a delay already from an early stage. But I recognise this myself, that sometimes the animosity that I get online from parents as well, which is quite upsetting, that causes you to try to protect yourself from anxiety and stress. And then I asked Martina to write something from what would be your response. And what she answered was, the most challenging for people with autism is the idea that people around them think they understand, which leads to a kind of taking over their life and controlling them. From family to professionals, being able to take one's life over leads to a feeling of superiority, which easily leads to discrimination and fighting for your own opinions against all odds. Of intentions, leaving the people with autism bewildered by a kind of feeling of inferiority, their self-esteem severely damaged. It causes their potential for growth to be seriously suppressed, a kind of psychological lynching. It is living in a psychological war zone. An attitude of not understanding, with modesty and respect, would not only lead to asking the people with autism about their self-knowledge, which would be of decisive importance, but also simply respectful and civil. Now, both statements are quite strong statements, but in both statements I really find things that resonate in them. Maybe something to think about as well, of the taking over, of how easy that can happen, and how can we think more from the perspective of development. So one of the last myths that I would like to end with is the idea of people with autism take things literally. Yeah, human beings take things literally when we don't understand. It's maybe one of the biggest problems in communication. If you take somebody literally and you don't understand what they meant, then you can really misunderstand the gist behind it, and that can become a big problem in communication. When I think of children with autism or people with autism taking something literally or a lot of things literally, essentially what you then find is the gaps in the knowledge, the gaps in what I talked about earlier, the framework, the gaps where there's a bit of missing information which they don't know, they can't help it, they were busy with developing something different at that age. So it means that instead of, oh, that's autistic behaviour, or oh, that's her being her again, that's the autism, then maybe the perspective of, gap in knowledge, or oh, I need to check whether she's understood because I think I haven't explained it in the way that she needed it. It gives the potential again for a nice level of connection where it's not from the perspective of something going wrong, but it's more from the perspective of yourself not having explained something in the way that the person needed it, or maybe it being the wrong time to try to explain it, or just the person's too stressed, but instead of thinking, oh, that is their autism, maybe we can think from a more human perspective of, okay, I haven't explained it well enough. Instead of they are taking it literally, they don't understand me. I think this attitude would help us in all areas of life, let alone if you're working with people with autism. It's a bit of self-knowledge which personally helps me an awful lot. For the people with autism who are sitting here today, for me, you're the most important. Sorry to everybody else, but this is why I do the work I do. What I would like to give to you, pass on to you, is something that I've learned from other people, and that is the concept of agents of change and what true empowerment is. Often when we talk about empowerment, we talk about helping to empower somebody. Yes and no. You can help to empower somebody by giving the right environment. That is true. But true empowerment comes from the inside. And this sentence, this resonates a lot with me. Empowerment happens when a person who is seen as the problem begins to see him or herself as part of the solution. And this is where I hope that we are heading in more, where because we see ourselves as the solution, because we have the best knowledge about ourselves, even if we might not be able to dig down deep enough at that moment, we still carry it within us. And the environment can help us to find that internal knowledge and find our way forward. But true empowerment comes from the inside, not from somebody giving us the right to be empowered. These self-portraits, this is me, the self-portraits that I've made, you see the extremes of anger, sadness, and in the middle, an attitude of, for me, empowerment, of okay, chin up, and we're going to try it. And I'm not going to fight with people. There are too many, what Steve Silberman says, there are too many infights. It's not working. We need to work together. Maybe by understanding that autism is such an umbrella, an umbrella context. I think that's where a lot of the problems come from, that you have people who say, yeah, but my child cannot speak and cannot communicate, and that you have a person with autism who can speak, and then they say, yeah, but you shouldn't speak for my child. Well, you shouldn't speak for anybody, really. I'm just speaking for myself, and I'm passing on the information that I've got from other people with autism that I've spoken with. But maybe if we understand more that there are very, very different understandings of autism, like, for example, Rett's disorder, which we thought was autism, but it's a genetic disorder where boys can die from. It was never autism. It had autistic-like behaviour, but it was not autism as we understand it from birth, where you have an atypical development. Maybe if we understand that a bit more, we can then acknowledge that there are different lines within autism, and we can find the lines of the parents who have the children where they see the atypical development, and you can find the lines of the people with autism who experience that as well. I don't know, I'm just thinking of things, but in the end what it comes down to is not judging and understanding that you don't understand, and that's okay. And maybe there we can find each other a bit more in the not understanding, rather than shouting at each other of that is autism, this isn't autism. I think everybody agrees that it's an umbrella term, but how to find then the way forward within that diversity is really a big challenge. So become that agent of change, whether you're somebody with autism, or whether you're a parent, or whether you're a professional. Become that agent of change for your own profession, for your own environment. I hope that that's possible. I think it is. I believe in the inherent capacity of people, and I'm constantly amazed by the potential for development in each of us. Lastly, just a few reading tips and watching tips. If you haven't watched it, please do watch the film Life Animated, and try to watch it from the perspective of the delay and acceleration of development, because it's explained perfectly by the person himself. It's beautiful. And lastly, again, thank you very much, Heidi, for inviting me to be here digitally. And I'd like to say a big congratulations to Ellen and Felix. I've heard that you have received some awards for your work within the field of autism, and I'm looking forward to meeting you in September and hearing more about it. Thank you very much, guys, and have a lovely day. And yeah, I'm glad that I could be here, sort of not in person. Bye-bye.